Hello and welcome back to the Security Conversations podcast. Pretty excited about my guest this week. Nick Biasini is head of outreach at Cisco Talos. Nick, let's start right there. What is Cisco Talos and what does the head of outreach there do?
So Cisco Talos, we're the threat intelligence organization inside of Cisco. So the easiest way to think of us is if you have a Cisco security product, it blocks something. The reason it's blocking it is because of our group. That's basically what we do. As far as what I do as head of outreach, so I have a team of threat hunters. Our focus is on the breaking, most novel, interesting aspects of the threat landscape. Our focus is talking about stuff publicly. So most, if not all of the research we find ends up in a blog post, a white paper, a conference talk, something like that. We're always out there looking for both what criminals and state sponsor groups are doing and staying on the cutting edge of whatever is most concerning on the threat landscape.
Is all your work public? I mean, everything you do is publicly published, or do you have private reports that you do only to a subset of paying
No,
customers?
the overwhelming majority of what we do is public facing. So our real goal is to do as much as we can and publish it publicly. So I'm not a huge fan of private reports personally. I like stuff being disclosed publicly so everyone has the same kind of playing field that they're playing against.
And that has kind of become a little bit of a problem in our industry, right? Where a lot of the really hardcore work that is done by the private sector guys who have access to the data and who have the visibility and the intelligence to look at it, they're now like they're monetizing it. In fairness to them, they're a vendor, they're there to monetize it. People have to get paid for their work and so on. The issue is that it only becomes available to a subset of folks, and then data doesn't get shared properly across the board, and we have an ecosystem of exposure. How do we fix that?
So one of the things I've seen some groups do is they kind of put a time limit on how long things remain private. That's a really good approach. Like I have no qualms with people needing to make money. I mean, we all work for vendors. These are all companies. They have to generate revenue. I have no issues with that. The problem I have is when a report stays private for say a year and then something major happens and they're like, "Oh, well, we had this in a private report a year ago." Like that information should not stay private for a year.
But what's the window? What's the sweet spot window in your mind? Is it 3 months? Is it 1 month? Is it six
I mean,
months?
you have to have some wiggle room there, depending on the vendor and how much money they're trying to generate, that type of stuff. But at least after a few months, like that intel's not super fresh anymore. It is very, very valuable to make sure that everyone has access to the data, not just those with deep
Right.
pockets.
And in threat intelligence in general, data has a very short shelf life. That kind of the IOCs and the
Yeah,
telemetry and that kind
exactly.
of thing has a very short shelf life anyway. Just on the telemetry front, can you give a level set for the audience in terms of your visibility? You mentioned like a lot of what goes into protecting Cisco products
Mm.
comes out to your team. What are you using? Where are your data sources? Give me a sense of the scale of what you're seeing.
So we have so many different data sources. It's kind of daunting at times. Not just a lot of data sources, but a lot of different disparate data sources. So a lot of people have, say, a lot of visibility in one area. So they have like a lot of endpoint data, which is great. We have that too. But we also have a ton of DNS data and a ton of network data and a ton of web data and a ton of email data. So we have a very, very wide portfolio that kind of gives us visibility into a whole bunch of different buckets and the ability to kind of create that full chain, right? We're not just looking at endpoint data. We're able to see the endpoint, pull the emails, look at the network telemetry, and kind of develop that full picture of what's going on in a particular incident or with a particular campaign.
Yeah, you guys have like a really interesting parts there. Like I think it was OpenDNS. You're constantly bringing in new startups through acquisitions. I imagine sometimes it might feel like almost too much data, right? It's like
There's always new stuff popping up. There's never a week goes by where I'm like, oh, there's another data set we just added. Awesome. Something new to go dig in for me and my folks.
so. Nick, you and I have been around the block for a while. I remember meeting you at past SaaS conferences in a past life, talking about nation state threats and really tracking advanced tracker activities.
Mhm.
We're in the midst of I don't know a lot of noise and muddle around cyber war. Heading into the Ukraine Russia conflict, heading into this Gaza Israel conflict, and new conflicts popping up around the world. Mainstream headlines, CNN, New York Times, mainstream headlines are all cyber war, cyber war, cyber war. How do you define cyber war from your perch, and what does it actually look like?
So, to me, one of the biggest mistakes that people make is they conflate espionage with cyber war. a lot of what we see during wartime conflicts is more like traditional espionage, right? These campaigns are not things that happen overnight. These are things that take a very long time, lots of advanced planning, the like supply chain attacks and very, very sophisticated espionage campaigns are not thought up overnight. From my perspective, cyber war is a lot more about destructive actions. So seeing things that cause impacts on the battlefield, that to me is what cyber war is. And we do see some of that. But what we're seeing still today is, unfortunately, bombs are a lot more effective than bytes, right? It's more effective for them to do damage. And credit to places like Ukraine, right? That they have been attacked digitally on their power infrastructure and they were able to, be resilient, come back online and keep the lights on. Bombs are much harder things to overcome than bytes in a lot of these circumstances. And that's what we're seeing is still today, kinetic rules the battlefield. In the future, that might not be the case, but as of right now, it's still kinetic, kinetic, kinetic. There's not a lot of real cyber warfare going on right now, in my
But there's also a lot of cyber related activities that are directly linked to some kinetic activities, like taking out a satellite infrastructure in place
yes.
right before an attack, that kind of thing. We're starting to see malware associated with those. It's not at scale though, right? It's just pockets of a few things here and there you're mentioning.
Well, like you said, like those examples, that's a huge amount of work to get the infrastructure in place to be able to launch that type of attack. Like you're building that for months and months and months, waiting for the opportunity to use it. Those types of things aren't going to be dropping time and time again. Those are going to be more the exception than the rule. That's something that they potentially built months and months and months in advance, and we're just waiting for the opportunity to be able to leverage it.
Right. And a lot of the cyber activity we start to see related to international conflict is around disinformation as well, right? Just using cyber to kind of gain or gain the upper hand in the narrative. Can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing there, specifically as it relates to the Israel Gaza conflict?
Disinformation and misinformation is the real battlefield now. That's just a fact. That's where we're trying. And in the world we're living in today, where there's lots of allies supporting lots of groups on many different sides, the battle for misinformation and disinformation is very, very important. Because if you can drive wedges or bring more allies to your side, that really increases both your chances and potentially as damaging to your adversary. We're really seeing this kind of run at full speed. And because there's multiple conflicts going on at the same time, we're really getting kind of a crash course in what this looks like. And it's a lot of convoluted signals, contrasting opinions, people saying both sides of the same argument and pointing fingers at one another with lots of evidence to back it up. Now, that question becomes, how reliable is the evidence? Where is the data coming from? How many sources has it come from? And in today's like really, really quick turnaround world, people aren't really taking the time to validate, make sure that this stuff is real. Where is it coming from? Is it all single sourced? Did it come from some weird publication that spun up in existence 6 months ago? Or is it coming from a WAPO or a Financial Times or some very, very large reputable news organization? Unfortunately, today, all news isn't created equal.
And in this fog, everything it becomes impossible for the target, who the end users like you and I on the back end of say a Twitter message or a message somewhere. It's impossible for us to like verify all of that in real time, and it's such a flood that it feels like this is a losing cause, and this is the reality of what we'll be facing for a while.
And honestly, people are too focused on fake internet points, right? It's all about being viral and getting that stuff out more so than it is on, is this actually true?
Nick, I want to ask about attribution. Big topic that we've been talking about forever. But I want to know, I want to bring your attention to a trend that I noticed is that a lot of attribution of nation state campaigns today is a lot more direct than it used to be 5-6 years ago. I mentioned the early SAS where we met. It used to be a Russian speaking actor or a Chinese speaking actor or an actor with North Korean language characteristics. Today, Microsoft is saying, "Hey, this is Russia. This is SVR. There's not a vendor, private sector vendor saying, "Hey, this is GRU. This is the Russian intelligence service." The U.S. government is going public saying, "Hey, here's some IPs associated with China." Everyone is calling names bluntly. There's no more this So the question to you is, have we gotten so much better at attribution that these public statements should be trusted today?
So I think attribution's good and can be important. I trust attribution coming from a government probably implicitly more than coming from a vendor. I'm fine with attribution from a vendor, but I want to see the receipts. So talk to me about why you're making this attribution. Just making an attribution and saying, "Hey, this actor is associated with country X, Y, or Z," and providing absolutely no backing for saying that is where I have issue. Again, if you have the receipts, say what you're going to say, put the evidence out there, assign a confidence to it, and let people draw their own conclusions. But saying things definitively without any evidence, if you're not a government, is concerning to me because governments have access to human int and a lot of other things that they can't disclose. Vendors aren't held to that same standard. So there's every reason for them to say, here are the technical underpinnings for why we're saying this. Here's the connection between the code. Here's the connection between infrastructure overlap. Do something to show me why you're saying this.
What percentage of the public threat reports we see today fit that standard that you just described?
If I'm honest, it's not super high. So from our perspective, I won't let my folks say anything attribution wise if there isn't receipts. Like I always tell them, show me the receipts. Tell me why you're doing this. And that's what I would hope every vendor would hold their standard to.
But this comes to the crux of my question, right? Is that not many vendors are being held to that standard. The majority of what pretend to be threat intel reports are actually marketing documents without IOCs or telemetry to help others find things, right? How should defenders, let's say in my audience, I got a bunch of CISOs and defenders and guys in the trenches trying to figure out, wade through this noise of threat intelligence activity. How are we to take any of this seriously if the majority of vendors aren't showing receipts or aren't releasing IOCs and showing their work?
It's tough. I mean, honestly, you kind of have to look at their track record, right? Go back and look at the attribution they've done in the past. Have there been mistakes? Have they attributed to the wrong groups? Is there a lot of contradicting attribution out there? Those are the things to kind of focus on. That part of the problem is, what's the consequence to doing bad attribution?
There is none.
There isn't any. Like you're getting huge headlines for saying something that is potentially very newsworthy, but if you're wrong, there's no consequence to you being wrong. And that is part of the problem as well, is people feel emboldened to be able to say things that are a little bit excessive because there's no repercussion to making those outlandish claims. Nobody's there. There's no consequence to you really for saying that stuff.
So as a defender, it's up to me to figure out whether this guy has a track record. I feel like the current status is just you put the defender behind the eight ball. You're getting a lot of this attribution, name calling at the top. There's not a lot of showing your work and a lot of telemetry and a lot of IOCs being released. And even worse, like there's nothing for me to do to defend myself. Like there is nothing for me to say, hey, let me take this and go hunting privately and see if there's something on my network. And a lot of that passes even from some big vendors. I mean, we're not talking about small guys trying to make a name for themselves. And I'll say it. I've seen Microsoft put out threat intel reports with IOCs that are only available for Microsoft customers. Like this kind of weird world of where IOCs are and how it's being kind of traded and the value of it seems to me as an outsider not in the best interest of defenders. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
That's tough, right? Every vendor has their own prerogatives and things for doing things. Like our goal is, if we write about something, we're going to publish every IOC we can. Now, there are circumstances where specific things may prevent every single IOC from being published, but we're not going to publish a blog that doesn't have significant IOC underpinning or technical underpinning, because you said it. What defenders want to be able to do is go pivot. How do I go find if I was impacted by this? How do I make sure that the protections I have in place catch this stuff? And by having a technical analysis of the malware, by having the IOCs associated with it, it really gives defenders that opportunity. And as you said, not all vendors really adhere to that standard.
I feel like we're even kind of going backwards in time, like, right? It feels like Microsoft advisory bulletins with their patches used to have this good blocks of data that help me determine what is this vulnerability, does this affect my infrastructure. today all that stuff has been stripped out completely, and you just get this has been exploited in the wild, or Apple has information that this iOS patch that this iOS vulnerability may have been exploited in the wild. This kind of weird kind of hedging of language. And I, as an iPhone user, I'm saying, okay, what can I do to defend myself? There really isn't anything I can do to defend myself. So it's just kind of throwing words at the wind, and defenders are just like waving their arms around. Is that tractable? Is that something we can fix?
Well, so a lot of the problem too is we're moving away from the basics as well. Like everybody is always chasing the new tech, the new thing that they can roll out to help protect them. But in honesty, the basics are the things that are going to save you. Because when a new ODay rolls out and somebody pops everybody, you having proper network segmentation and proper access control and all these things in place is going to be the thing that saves you. Not that you have the latest and greatest piece of software that's out there. It really is, it's kind of two things, right? We're moving away from that, and we're infatuated with technology instead of looking at the things that we can do to really secure environments the way that we intended to 25, 30 years ago.
You mentioned OD. We're in the midst of what I consider an OD surge over the last, I would say, 2 years, maybe even 3 years. But just last year and this year, this dramatic surge in discovery of ODs actually being exploited in the wild. The question is, are we? Why are we finding so many more ODs? Are we just better at searching, or has there been more OD usage from adversaries? Where do you think we stand there?
I think it's a couple of factors. One is there are more zero-day researchers out there than there have ever been. And this has become a huge, huge, huge industry that may not have been nearly this big a decade ago. That's a huge part of it. Another part is we write huge amounts of software all the time, and software is getting incredibly complex and complicated, and more modules moving in and out. And it is always a mechanism of we need new features and we need them fast. And when you're moving at a fast pace and you're writing lots of code, their mistakes are going to get made, and you're going to find new vulnerabilities. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. There's more people looking, and there's also more software, and ever more software coming out at an increased, it almost seems like increased cadence pace, right? The releases are coming faster and more often than they used to previously.
Yeah, and on the OD front, we're starting to see newer targets start to emerge, like big targets, network devices, routers. I mean, your own company has had issues with OD and so on here. But not only, but I mean, across the board, big five, a big IP, as you look through this CISA careful list, the known exploitable vulnerabilities list, you're starting to see a significant trend where these things are starting to be popped by nation state type actors.
Yeah, the amount of activity we're seeing against networking devices and appliances in general is alarming. There's a lot of focus, not just from state-sponsored groups, but from criminal groups as well. They are really, really keenly focused on these devices. And I mean, honestly, it makes sense. They're very, very difficult to defend. They're not commonly looked at. They're just kind of a set it and forget it, leave it running in the background type of an approach.
Low hanging fruit, right?
Yes, exactly. And they have huge amounts of access as well, right? If you manage to pop a networking device, you're now sitting in the middle of the network. So you have all kinds of visibility into what network traffic is traversing, ways to get footholds to launch attacks in further environments. We see it in telcos a lot. They're really focused on telcos and networking devices because it's a huge amount of visibility across a huge amount of locations in one shot, basically.
Feels also like a very dark place for researchers. Like researchers are not there picking apart that kind of telemetry. And what I'm hearing, it's also very, very difficult to get data out of device vendors around like firmware things being attacked and like people signing, demanding NDAs for things. It feels like from a threat research perspective, that's a ripe area for research. It's heavily targeted, but defenders, again, are in the dark, and researchers as well have limited access to even look at these things.
It's tough too because most of these things are purpose-built hardware, right? It's not like it has the capability to all of a sudden be like, let's run this massive security stack on top of here on this piece of hardware that was purpose-built to be able to push networking traffic through at as high a rate as possible. There's a lot of challenges there. I mean, it is a soft spot, no doubt. One thing I will say, please, please, please do not turn web interfaces onto things open to the internet unless you highly restrict it. ACL the hell out of it, because too often we're seeing way too many people expose like management interfaces to the open internet, and that's just, it's a recipe for disaster.
And by the same token, please, please, please don't ship default software with stuff connected to the internet and allow unauthenticated access to things. I mean, you pin it on people deploying this stuff. This stuff ships out of the box connected to the internet in many cases, and the responsibility should be on the vendor to do this secure by default, secure by design thing we're talking about, right?
That is absolutely true as well. Making sure that by default it's not there and letting users know that they're doing it. And often there will even be prompts saying, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And people still will click through. That stuff has got to stop.
We're also seeing just on the trend, just to pinpoint some trends I wanted to ping you about was this APT starting to pop up in some really interesting new places, strange places maybe in my mind, but new places in Africa, throughout Africa, are starting to see a lot of buzz about some really interesting threat actor groups in certain places. Africa, I mentioned, down Latin America, throughout Latin America, and then more recently in Guyana, which is an English speaking former British colony. I'm from Guyana. And I feel I see reports of a Chinese APT popping up in a country like Guyana. It makes me open my eyes. What do you make of this? Is it now that we're just starting to look there? It's always been there. We're now starting to look, or are you starting to see adversaries do something specific there?
Well, I think it's a combination of things, right? The kind of the attack surface in those countries has exploded over the last 5 or 10 years, right? There's so much more infrastructure in these places that's attackable than was there previously. And again, countries are always going to do espionage, but if cyber espionage is an option, they're going to go cyber espionage 100 times out of 100. It's cheap, it's effective, it allows them to get a huge amount of visibility, it's fast as opposed to having to build all these other things. So you're really starting to see more and more visibility in that space. On the flip side of that, we've also seen kind of the democratization of access to this type of capability, right? Where private sector offensive actors have exploded. There's huge marketplaces for exploits, for capabilities. So the amount of countries and states that have these capabilities has absolutely blown out exponentially over the last 5 or 10 years. And now you have a ton more players in the space. Previously, it was kind of kept to a smaller group of people, countries that had deep pockets and had spent decades building these capabilities. Now, if anybody has the money, they can go out and buy capabilities that previously would have only been held by a small handful of states.
You mentioned private sector offensive actors. Can you just linger there for a second? How do you define a private sector offensive actors? And are you talking about folks like NSO Group, Kandiru, and a lot of these mercenary groups that we're starting to hear about? Private sector groups selling hacking services or exploits and so on to interesting new people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, private sector offensive actors, it kind of originally sprung out of the idea of commercial spyware or mercenary spyware, but then realizing it's actually a lot bigger than that. The mercenary landscape is huge. Like a lot of focus is paid to spyware, but hack for hire is an exploding business. There is tons and tons of exploit development and exploits available for purchase. Those things and those private sector offerings have really kind of shaken things up because now you have all these countries all over the world that, for a state, a couple $1,000,000 is nothing. But that gives them a capability to do some very, very sophisticated things. And in the case of mercenary spyware or commercial spyware, compromise basically anyone who has a phone, which is incredibly concerning.
The US government has responded to this through using sanctions, the threat of sanctions and putting people on lists and so on. But that only applies to a handful of vendors. And, NSO Group in Israel is been like the poster child for this, along with Kandiru and the Predator folks. However, I'm starting to see public reports and hear a lot of buzz about a lot of these mercenary hacking groups, like you described, right here in the US, in the West, in parts of Europe. This is not like hidden in Macedonia or hidden in Cyprus anymore. Can you talk a little bit about how much of this is actually happening on the ground and how much of it is in the open? And is the US government sanctions approach even applicable against what we're actually talking about here beyond the spyware world?
So it's tough, right? Because you have to do something, but on the same side, you have to acknowledge the fact that these capabilities do have a purpose, right? There is a time and a place for these capabilities to exist. The problem is how do you regulate on a global stage where not everybody is playing by the same rules? So the US government and governments have to do something because there are far too many activists, dissidents, journalists, and human rights abuse going on in this landscape for them not to do something. The challenge is, do you go after the companies that are doing the commercial spyware? Do you go after the companies that are doing exploit development and exploit sales? Do you go after the hack for hire? Do you go after the people who are paying for the services? There's so many different avenues. And the biggest challenge is we need everyone in the world to kind of get together and realize a path forward. Because if you don't get global, agreement on this, then it's fine. All you're doing is restricting, say, the United States companies from being able to purchase this. But if you go into some other regions of the world, they have no issue being able to make these same purchases because their governments don't adhere to the same level of control around these types of tools. So it's a very, very tough problem to crack. We're actively working to try and do as much as we can. From our perspective, a lot of it is exposing what's going on. There's not, you talked about the lack of sharing. This is an area where there is zero sharing. I mean,
Zero.
it's like a desert when it comes to indicators, real indicators around mercenary spyware and PSOA activity. It doesn't exist. And that's something that we are desperately trying to change.
There's some nuance to the conversation. I think you mentioned it there too, because I read some reporting out of Israel that the Israeli government is actually turned to the NSO group for help locating hostages, perhaps compromising cell phones on hostages to determine location. There's legitimate use cases for this, for law
Mm-hmm.
enforcement, for this kind of intelligence activity. How do we weigh and balance the nuance there when, there's a legitimate use case, but on the flip side, we have all the civil society being targeted and it kind of becoming a wild west, like you described? How do we balance the need for
It's a really tough. I mean, honestly, it kind of has to be like, what is your track record? Okay, you've used this technology, you purchased that technology, what did you do with it? Oh, you said you were doing it for purposes of rooting out terrorism or processing criminals, but oddly, there's been 5 activists and dissidents in your country who have recently been found to have this on their systems. Like the proof is in the way that you use it. So it's a very difficult mechanism. And because there's no continuity on what the rules are for how these companies engage, who they can engage with, how they can engage, it becomes very difficult because they could go to the EU and do one thing, they could go to the Middle East and do a different thing, they could go to Asia and do something else, they could go to South America and do something else, because all of these countries all have different rules and regulations associated with not just how they sell, but how they set up and operate. Where can they operate out of? What are types of controls or export controls do they have? There's just no consistency, unfortunately.
Just before we wrap up, we're running out of time. I wanted to flip back to the original question of threat intelligence and the value of threat intelligence. We talked about the diminishing returns and the shelf life of IOCs and so on. Okay, help a defender, help a CISO understand how can good threat intelligence fit into a mature security program, and what is good threat intelligence? Like how would you define a good threat intelligence product?
So the first and foremost thing, you said a keyword there, mature. If you are not a very mature security organization, I don't think you're necessarily in a place where you can make huge gains using threat intelligence. Now, what does good threat intelligence look like? To me, good threat intelligence is based on what your threat profile is. If you are a defense contractor, you need really good threat intel on what's going on from the various state sponsor groups that are out there. If you manufacture toys, you probably don't. But what you do need to do is have a really clear understanding of what ransomware cartels look like, what these groups are doing, how they operate, and you need intelligence to defend yourself. So it's kind of hard to say a one size fits all approach to threat intelligence because it does really depend on what your risk profile is and what the threats are that you're kind of facing. But having the intel on the groups that you're concerned about, indicators associated with those groups, and ways to actually leverage it in your own environment are the 3 things that really lead to a strong threat intelligence program.
The problem is that that's like you mentioned, if you're not a mature security program, threat intelligence you might not even be ready to absorb threat intelligence and use it in a meaningful way. The reality is that not many programs are modern. I mean, look at Okta. Look at the victims, falling victims to these ransomware victims. These are big time security companies with CISOs and big time security programs that we consider them modern. They're all getting popped here, there, and everywhere. So the question to you is, I don't know. I don't know how to ask the question. It feels like we're in the midst of a lost cause where we're just kind of all flitting around trying to defend things and there's no real structure to being secure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's tough out there. I mean, you're dealing. One of the things that you're dealing with too is the landscape is shifting, right? 10 years ago, everybody talked about social engineering. Oh, social engineering is going to be the next big thing, and then nothing ever happened. And then suddenly, it's everywhere, and it is just the bane of most corporations' existence. Is people want to help, and you don't even need to have the most technically, you don't have to be this incredibly technologically sophisticated person. You just have to be able to talk to people and get them to do things that you want them to do, and you can inflict massive amounts of damage. You saw all the stuff out of the com and them kind of starting to work with ransomware groups. That is incredibly concerning because their big MO is like SIM swapping and social engineering. It's not, figuring out how to pop exploits and getting users to click emails. That's just not their MO. So the landscape is changing. And I feel like right now, you need to be agile. You need to be ready to jump into those new areas. What's your social engineering program look like? What type of training are you doing for your employees? How are you defending against SIM swapping? What are you doing to take on the really cutting edge threats? What are you doing on MFA abuse? How are you handling those types of things? Adversaries aren't going to be popping boxes. They're going to be logging in with valid credentials. That's what adversaries do now. And trying to defend against that is inherently far more difficult.
I leave it right there. Nick Biasini, Head of Outreach at Cisco Talos. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.